Oh, here we go.
Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to this panel for National Flash Fiction Day. The theme of our panel is Writing Our World, and it's a real privilege to be here moderating this panel. This theme invites us to consider the ways in which we are, as writers, influenced by our immediate environments, how the world around us makes possible the worlds that we create on the page. And it asks us to think about how we build sort of vivid and lively worlds through writing, be they physical worlds, speculative worlds, interior worlds, alternative worlds, familiar and strange worlds. And we have an amazing panel for you today. And I'm going to just really briefly introduce each of the speakers. We have Shelley Burnfield, who is a fiction writer, especially of short fiction, as well as creative non-fiction. And I'm very excited to say that she's been a finalist this year in the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, which is an enormous achievement. We have Lola Alvey, who is the founding editor of the youth journal Fingers, Toes, and she runs the Youth National Flash Fiction Day competition and puts an enormous amount of energy and talent into sort of bolstering youth writing in this country. She herself writes music, poetry, and other forms of creative fiction and non-fiction. Mriga Sethi is a poet, a storyteller, and a very talented performer. Her work has appeared in a wide range of journals, magazines, and anthologies. Ataria Sharman is a writer of fiction, non-fiction and poetry. She's the author of the children's novel, Hine and the Tohunga Portal, which has been described by one reviewer as an absolute joy, bursting with adventure. And we have Victor Bello, who's a poet and a writer, and his poetry collection Sets was published in 2020. And he has a wonderful weekly satirical poem published in Newsroom, which, if you haven't checked out, really are worth reading. They're incredibly hilarious and incisive. So we have an incredible panel today. We will be discussing the theme of the panel, but also there'll be an opportunity for some very short readings. I'm going to pose some questions. I'm happy for you all to take them in any way that you want, to talk about what writing means to you and how you do it. I will give you an opportunity to do some readings, but please, if in answering your question an opportunity arises to use your reading as a sort of a way of talking through your points, please just include it if it naturally comes up. And I will sort of throw the questions at you in to different people as we get on. But please just jump in if you wish. Okay, so the first question I wanted to pose to the panel was about how the environment and how the physical world around you, and physical not just being the natural world, but whatever the kind of environments we live in are, the way in which they shape your writing and the way in which you sort of develop methods or rituals to stay attentive to the world around you in order for it to be a sort of force in your writing. So perhaps, Shelley, you might want to kick us off. Do you feel like answering that one to start with, to putting you on the spot?
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I've been thinking about it, and really for me, it's about every day. Like you talked about a story. I'm going to read a story, a little story today, and it's about racism, because around me, I and my whānau and my friends and children at school are faced with this every day. It's in our environment. It's in everything. So I'm not necessarily attentive to it, but it kind of just smacks you in the face. Like you're not really, you know, walking down the street. Like literally, I was in a town a few months ago, hanging out outside a shop waiting for my my stepdaughter, who was in the pharmacy, and waiting for for her to come and have a coffee. And a lady came out straight out to my face. I'd been there for maybe 5 minutes, just milling around on the street waiting. She came out of the shop right into my face and said, "What are you doing here?" And I just was sort of like really taken aback. And in the end, I kind of was just like waiting for my friend. And then it sort of went on, but it was definitely, you know, a race. She thought I was casing the joint and things like that. So it's all around me. So I tend to write about those sorts of things. Yeah.
That's a wonderful point about the sort of social milieu being also a kind of really important part of how we think about the environment, not just our physical worlds, but these kind of invisible but kind of clearly powerful forces. Does anyone else want to answer that question too? Thank you, Shelley. That was a really important point.
I'll add something if I may. Shelley, thank you for sharing that painful story. I'm sorry that happened to you, and sorry that it happens so often. In Singapore, we have similar social anxieties that are not always so in your face, but to minorities, they're abundantly apparent. So as a queer person in Singapore, my partner and I have very few rights. And lately, I find myself writing a lot more about situations where we're deliberately misunderstood to not be together, or not be a couple. And I found myself writing sonnets about that, where sort of the beauty and modernity of the city collides with these minor but very palpable and regular microaggressions that happen. So I just wanted to add that to what you were saying, Shelley. Thank you.
It's a great point.
Kia ora. Yeah, a really good point. Thank you for that. And yeah, I'm sorry that happens too. It happens all too often. And to a lot of people, I think, as Catherine said, it's invisible, but to the people who experience it, it can become, it's all around.
Yeah,
I'd like to talk a little bit. I think for me, because I write fantasy, and so I get a lot of my ideas when I'm out in nature. So there's a Manaia Maunga up here. I live in Whangarei. And for my next novel, as I was writing, I'm writing my next novel, and so when I was walking up the Maunga, I'm kind of like looking at things, and like maybe there's a rock or a big rock that's kind of stands out, or maybe like a cave under the rock. So I get inspiration or ideas to then bring into my writing through like real life nature, and then I kind of just I kind of think of it as like overlaying the fantasy onto that. So imagining that there are like creatures in there or whatever it is. So I think for me, nature or Papatūānuku, Mother Earth is a big influence for me. But yeah, drawing back on what everyone else has already mentioned as well, our life experiences, growing up, the things that happen to us, obviously, that is a huge part of world building for our writing. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, this point about the environment not just being the things that you can physically see, but actually the social environment as well. And in my case, I grew up traveling a lot, so I was always in different cultures and different social environments. And there's something about that, the intimacy that you get, that you develop with nature, first of all, because that's kind of the thing when you're always on the move. Nature is kind of the thing that's never really changing. It is always changing, but there's something quite constant about the change. And whereas the social situation is always different. And then you also develop this intimacy with people from different cultures. You get this, it's a specific kind of intimacy when you're communicating with someone where you don't speak the same language or you don't come from the same background, but you're finding ways to connect anyway. And there's something really interesting about navigating that space and incorporating like these aspects of our environment as well into our own writing.
I think that the idea of intimacy is a wonderful one for us to sort of think about, because writing requires a type of attentiveness to being in the world. I find it a wonderful way of being very present, because to really absorb the sorts of details that make writing lively from the world around us, you have to really look and hear and feel. And so I think just the practice of being a writer is also a practice of being in the world, which is kind of something I'm quite grateful for. Shirley, would you like to offer us a little reading, since you sort of described some important things?
Yeah,
we'd love
I'll just explain this. This is so this is quite confronting, so I'll just explain that now. So this is about racism in schools and our rangatahi, like I'm talking about kids I know, in a situation where a Pākehā teacher knew that this stuff was going on and tried to get help to help these kids who were being targeted by other teachers, and then found that none of the other Pākehā teachers would support him in that help. And so there are, we've been sort of fighting these social issues for a couple of years now at a school, and it affects whānau, it affects children, it affects teachers. So yeah, this is my story. It's called "The White Teachers Stop Talking When I Enter the Lunchroom." My Pākehā friend Roger told me the white teachers stop talking when I enter the lunchroom. Teachers can be bitches to each other for sure, and I thought the quick silence was simply Carol being an asshole, since I'd snaffled the job as science HOF. No, Roger said it was because I was Māori and most of the senior leadership team are racist AF. Roger told me they talk about rangatahi as if they are ants to be stepped on, or at least chased off kura grounds. The DP, surprisingly, possesses a blacklist of kids who will be booted out of school into training programs. Other students are close enough to their 16th birthdays to be encouraged to stay at home. What in the holy hicka? I didn't even suspect. It crushed the wind out of me. I can handle jealous bitches, but lousy racism is simply the worst. Where? Just when I thought we'd moved the dial, learn to love one another, the old dirty finger is shoved right back up and mostly hidden behind white whispers. Roger is the English HOD, and he is pissed, but careful at the same time. Are you okay, love? What should we do? Oh, Roger, ye of little faith, I'm going to throw down a whittle. Once our community finds out about this, we'll haka, we'll break those dirty bird fingers right off and slap their cheeks as hard as a paddle with their own lily white hands. Gosh, that's quite violent talk, isn't it? Oh, Roger Kare, I'm just kidding. We'll support the senior leadership. We'll report the senior leadership team to the Teachers' Council and the Ombudsman and the Education Watchdogs and the Human Rights Commission. Will you tautoko me with all the talking? Will you help? Roger? Hello, Roger? Thank you.
That was wonderful. That was absolutely wonderful, and enraging and beautiful. Thank you so much. It's one thing to hear us talk about these things in terms of our approaches, and then to hear the writing really is kind of something else. I want to talk about the fact that the last few years have been kind of exceptional. We've been living in kind of a state of emergency, and this is a sort of opportunity for kind of new emergences at the same time. And I just wanted to think about what it meant to write now, and how kind of writing might actually be a kind of literal act of sort of world building as this world is kind of coming out of this pandemic. So how does writing figure in the sort of way in which we're sort of in this moment of the world? Victor, do you want to speak to that? I mean, with your poetry is so prescient in the way it engages, and I think you'd have some.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed you praising it up. It definitely gets a reaction. It's not always a good one, so I'm sure a few of us can appreciate that vibe too. Yeah, in that sense of yeah, I was looking over the these questions earlier, and it kind of gave some thought to that. Certainly, there's a lot of stuff happening in the world at the moment, so it kind of provides a lot of things to move on and write about. And I mean, just personally with me, I find a lot of obviously all the social issues are, incredibly delicate, and if anything, we're moving into a world at the moment where things are very intense and polarized, and that can't be helped. I mean, I don't think we're going to get a consensus on it. It's going to be one way or the other, and people are picking their sides, and unfortunately that doesn't maybe fit in. It sounds very nice, but that's the reality. We're either going to live in a world that is very cruel and harsh and hierarchical world, or one where we have a bit of distribution of power amongst people who don't have it or have less of it. So without getting too, I mean, obviously everyone's here is thinking very deeply about those issues. I guess because we're limited in time, I'll just say one thing that comes to me when it's writing about like this, the idea of building a new world out of writing or so forth. One thing that comes to me is that I'm very politically active, well, as much as I can be for it. It has been with kids and stuff, but I mean, I keep that. I do that, and that's my focus on politics, and that's a changing the world, and in whichever way you want, that's what I do. But I do it outside writing. And writing, I allow my mind and my creativity or whatever to go in another direction. And actually, in writing, my writings, the odes are a bit of it. They're just a joke, but hopefully one that gives it has got a bit of a point. But most of my other writing, dealing with the world, it's very dark, because that side of me goes, actually, no, there is no hope. There's no hope. We're, as a species, as a planet, we're screwed, and I can't see that changing quickly. But on the other side of that is reflected in my writing. I'm presenting a future where there is no hope. But on the other side of that, I also think there's another rational part of my brain, which is going, maybe we need to get to the point where there is no hope, where we can have a realistic appraisal of how we continue the struggle, because everyone's dealing with their and this is where writing interacts with your psychology, with your creativity, with your spirituality, if that's part of it, and also with that world building. So my writing, it's pretty it offers no hope, but I also, my other side of me goes, I hope that's wrong. So I don't know. There's a contradiction. I haven't figured it out myself yet. I don't even know if it makes any sense. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's part of the interest of writing. It doesn't always have to make complete sense. So that was my short rant and reply to that one, Catherine. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, this relationship we have with hope. And where writing sits within that, because we can have other parts of us that interact with hope and pragmatism in different ways. But actually that does raise an interesting, I think, sort of question for the panel about how hope and the sort of writing towards worlds. I mean, some of you write speculatively, which allows you to really sort of hope in quite sort of wildly fantastical directions, or in very metaphorical directions. So how, I'd love some thoughts from the panel on this idea of writing towards worlds, and where hope sits, whether there are other modes of sort of optimism beyond hope, or other modes of action beyond hope that you like to engage in. Riga, do you want to try that one?
Well, I wouldn't dream of seeing hope where there is none, but I'm not a speculative writer, but I wanted to speak to what Victor was saying in a slightly different way, which is that I write to change my mode of attention, or have written to change my mode of attention, especially over the past 2 years. And maybe it feels a little naive, but we were locked down in our neighborhoods, as I'm sure all of us were for long, long periods of time, New Zealand especially. I sort of, my attention shifted, and I became so aware of my neighborhood and the birds that had started coming, the birds that come to our porch. There was a family of Oriental hornbills that started visiting the neighborhood, just 8 enormous kind of prehistoric looking birds that were in our pretty contemporary urban neighborhood. There was a 3 or 4 roosters that were sitting on a compound wall, and over the 2 months that we were in lockdown, my mode shifted. And it's not that overall the world improved. When I think about the apocalypse and think about how we could possibly survive it, or how I personally could survive it, I don't imagine an enormous change or enormous action that I could somehow affect, but I imagine what it would look like in my mind. How would I relate to the world before me in my mind, and how that attention would somehow make that world survivable, if that makes sense. And I sort of got a glimpse of that during the lockdown, and trying to write poems about just what I saw in the neighborhood. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, the question of how much writing can influence the world, I think, is one we all think about. I always think of Tracy K. Smith, the poet's. She made the point that writing doesn't necessarily change the world immediately, but what it does is it is a kind of act of sort of marking dissent, and that the act of marking dissent can have a powerful effect down the line. In a way that I think is really, really important. Shelley, you wanted to say something.
No, I was just clapping Riggers.
Yes. Lola, do you want to say anything to that question of hope and writing towards worlds?
Yeah, sure. Just following up from Riga's comment, actually, it's interesting how I think a lot about how, especially because I'm working with young writers a lot, and young writers, lots of young writers really love speculative fiction, writing it and especially reading it. And it's not actually a genre I do much myself, but I see their writing or I hear about what they're reading. And one thing that's interesting about this whole COVID period is that people have been writing speculative fiction about pandemics that come and change the world for decades. And there's always this speculation about how that will damage the world and how that will damage people and creativity and our souls. And it's quite a philosophical question. But when it comes down to it, it's interesting that in the last couple of years, and of course, right now we're not, I mean, the world hasn't completely fallen apart yet, but in the last couple of years, people actually just keep going, and creativity keeps going. And it even in the face of lockdown and extreme stress, and really we're dealing with the stuff of fiction right now and the stuff of apocalypse right now, but we're still finding ways to create and connect with each other, which I think is really powerful. And it's just interesting how you never really know how you're going to react to a situation until you're really in it. And I think creativity and human connection really has a way of persevering. So maybe I'm a bit of an optimist, but at least in the last couple of years.
That's a great point. I read an interview with Susanna Clarke, who won the Women's Book Prize last year for Piranesi, and she made the point she had a chronic illness, and she couldn't really leave the house much, and it was actually, so she sort of ended up not really being able to sort of do the sort of living in the world research that is required, and she ended up writing that novel, this deeply kind of internal, creative, starkly original novel, because of the limitations. And I think not to romanticize those, but to think about, what this sort of pandemic has created in terms of conditions for sort of introspection and being still. Ataria, do you want to sort of, as a speculative writer who amongst many talents, do you want to sort of talk about maybe the potential of that sort of world building for meeting this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's speculative, fiction. There's so much power, because I guess you can do whatever you want. You're not really constrained by what's happening in our world, like in our 3D world at the moment. I want to talk a bit about hope, actually, because I write for children, so I do feel a responsibility to be somewhat hopeful, and I feel like I do have hope. One of the ways that I did it with Hin and the Tohunga Portal is so it's written for children, but specifically targeted towards tamariki Māori, and so there are only Māori characters in it. So in that way, it's a space where the children who are of Māori descent can read it, feel safe. And I think that in itself is really powerful, and that as writers, that writing can be a rongoa. Absolutely. I know people who have read stuff that has healed them, that has healed their trauma. I mean, not all writing, and not to put writing on like a pedestal above anything else, but it's just that the potentialities are there for it as a form to do that. And I think the other thing that I thought of was that when you're creating a world and characters, so I've got two children characters, whoever reads it is experiencing their world and the world that they're in. And so as the author, you can teach people so much, like through the experiencing of being in your characters. And that is really powerful, because that's putting someone else in someone else's shoes, like Shelley's piece, you know, for someone who hasn't had the experiences that many of us have had, that is really powerful for them to get kind of an awakening in a way. So yeah, I think definitely writing is world building, world changing. Yeah.
I think it's time to hear some more writing. Maybe we'll have a couple of pieces now. Perhaps Ataria and Victor, would you like to read some pieces? Maybe Ataria, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll keep it short. So this is, yeah. Oh, sorry, that's my dog. This is just a short couple of the first chapter, part from one of the first chapters. Hohepa yelled out as he was hit across the head. He fell to the ground, then his motionless body was hoisted over his shoulder. The man who had picked him up smiled at her, and Hine screamed. Where his eyes should have been were only gaping black holes. His stretched mouth revealed teeth that had been sharpened into thin points like the teeth of a shark. Hine's hair was stuck to her brow with sweat. Her breath quickened. She choked on her words. Where are you taking him? She screamed. She fell backwards onto her kumu as the trees started shaking. A roar echoed through the forest, and suddenly, to her disbelief, a giant scaly beast poked its head through. Pine needles pricked at the palms of her hands, drawing droplets of blood. She ignored the pain and screamed. The head of the thing was the size of a small car. The scales were brown with grain red scattered through its leathery hide. Again, where the eyes were meant to be, there was only darkness. Hine's mind raced to the book of myth and legends her mum used to read to her. Is that a taniwha? The taniwha opened its mouth to reveal a pulsating and red tunnel. The men ran up the pink tongue and down the throat, still carrying the lifeless body of Hohepa. As soon as they disappeared, the mouth shut, and the taniwha flicked its tongue with satisfaction.
Wonderful, wonderful. The endorsement, the best endorsement I can offer you is that I had a 7-year-old in the house, and he went very quiet.
Oh,
and was listening to that. So
oh, cool.
I think your work is done. Beautiful, beautiful and evocative. I loved it. Victor, over to you.
Yeah, I was about to say, I just about went quiet when I heard that description. It was pretty, that was very effective. I liked it. I liked it a lot. This is funny because what I'm writing is here, it's not a long piece, but I'll just a little bit of an explanation. It's kind of, it is speculative. I love speculative fiction. I don't have the discipline, I don't think, of some of these novelists and things. I'm working on that. That's my weak point. But it's a form I admire. And funnily enough, this kind of features a monster, but it's written in the form of a very boring encyclopedia style entry. So anyway, let's compare and contrast. This one's called The Ships, and it's from a mythical encyclopedia. When a ship was born, it emerged from the Hadal zones, the abyssal deep. 2 navigators were bonded to it for the duration of their life cycle of a century or more. Sealed in an oblong sac of opaque cartilage above the prow bone, The navigators slid in a bath of tawny liquid, bulbous craniums and disc-like eyes barely discernible behind the filmy screen. They were locked into thick fibrous strands that burrowed into the bodywork of the vessels, connecting the navigators with the ship at an organic level, making them a collective organism. In the ship's fluted structures were capillaries and ducts where fluids coursed and nerves pulsed with firings. The slick, rubbery flanks trembled with a kind of inchoate life. The ships were living. When they rose from their childhood in the black water to the foreign surface, they slowly acclimatized to the air, the sun, the wind, the sharp noise, and the emptiness of life above the waves. Crews came from across the sea, from the islands, and waited in flimsy ketches until a ship approached and chose them, edging close until its shadow dwarfed them. The crews were attached to one ship only, and if a ship sickened or returned back to the depths for some unknown reason, they did not return to the seas. They were married to the ship, and they scarified their limbs with old symbols and grim acknowledgement. The ship sailed with a shriek of air rushing through its gills, the crew deep within its cavernous abdomen, where chemical light shone a dull illumination for the benefit of its symbiotes. And that's that. And just now I'm going to go on for 2 seconds, and just to hooking back to that earlier question that you were asking or we were discussing about world building. That's the thing about the world that really fascinates me at the moment, and that's what's a great thing about speculative fiction. You can dip in and out of worlds, you can dip in and out of the present world, the future worlds, alternative worlds, but that kind of what's happening at the moment is this kind of weird acceleration and joining up between biology and technology, and I am working on this work which is set in the distant future where these things have kind of joined together and things have fallen apart, but you still have these artifacts, legacies of this advanced technology in a world that no longer really understands it. So yeah, so that's my little excuse for that thing. Thank you for tolerating me.
Thanks for Jules Verne and Herman Melville.
Oh, now we're talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, if only.
It had a really wonderful sort of pulsing energy to it. Black water to the foreign surface. Gosh, that made me tingle. Really, really wonderful. Thank you. I wonder, actually, when I look at us as a group, we're a group of writers that moves between quite a few different genres of writing, particularly between sort of poetry and shorter or longer versions of fiction. And I wanted to just reflect upon what it means to move between these different genres, and why or how often, we don't know why, but how we go into the different modes of writing. So and thinking about flash fiction, sometimes people sort of distinguish it from poetry by this notion of kind of movement. So I wonder for you all how you, whether there are particular genres you write in for particular things, or when the world sort of prompts you to write in a particular genre. For me, I find I can be more disciplined with fiction in terms of sitting down and writing it. Poetry seems to have a life of its own for me in terms of when it wants to emerge. But I'd love to hear you talk about your processes of kind of engaging and building words through different genres.
Personally, I think it's interesting, this distinction that you bring up with movement, because personally, I think poetry also has movement to it that is really important. I just think that looks different in the hands of different writers, especially. And one of the things that I like about flash fiction and poetry and writing in general, but somehow with these smaller forms, it really stands out, is this attention to language and how much you actually can rely on the natural pulse and rhythm and the musicality of the language, which I think brings with it this kind of movement, this momentum that you have in poetry and flash fiction. And I wonder, personally, for me, that is something that makes it natural to navigate between the two forms, because they both have this kind of inherent pulse to them. And I think I mentioned earlier that for me, I tend to write a lot of poetry. So I don't write a lot of longer short stories, because that somehow, then you're talking about movement over a much broader spectrum that is, whereas I tend to like the really small moments. And I think then the distinction between flash and poetry is not so specific, is not so easily definable, perhaps. And I wonder if for some of the other poets and flash fiction writers in the room, if that concept of movement and musicality applies. I'm just wondering.
Love to hear some other thoughts on
Yeah.
genre. Shelley.
Yeah, really interesting, Lola. And it's there's those beats that go through the dramatic and the emotional arcs and things like that. And I don't know if I'm doing it right with the flash fiction, because I kind of tend to get a short story and then I just go like that. I try and have a beginning, middle, and end. So I think you still do have those beats. Is that what you're talking about? Like sort of the musicality? I'm not sure. That's sort of metaphor for me. But yeah, I'm interested in seeing what other people say, because I'm a baby at it.
I want to add to this motion that Shelley just made, and to me, what poetry and flash fiction have in common is this idea of compression, and the density of the matter that happens when you compress it, and so much of the impact of this dense matter happens in the mind of the reader once the poem or the story has been imparted. And that's what I'm attracted to, is this idea of compression and density. I mean, I think the elements of plot they're everywhere, and in storytelling, certainly when I perform on the stage, but even in poetry, when you're trying to move from that first stanza to the last. I mean, I hesitate to say elements of plot at this stage, because I've recently started thinking about how Western or white supremacist traditional elements of plot or Aristotelian elements of plot really are. So who knows? Maybe you're doing it right, Shelley, and we're doing it wrong.
I'm not sure there is a right or a wrong. And I think, and that's kind of what I meant. I don't know if this really answered Catherine's question, but the idea that it's different in different in the hands of different writers. Some writers think in terms of plot and character. Some writers come up with these amazing characters, and then other writers rely on the rhythm of the language, or I shouldn't really say rely either, because it's obviously more than that. But the things that we're drawn to, I guess, in our writing is probably unique for all of us, but there is some common ground, perhaps.
I just want to quickly just offer one comment on that. I was in the Masters of Creative Writing at Auckland University with Jack Remy Cottrell, who's like one of the best writers of anything I've ever known and read. And so he writes the best lists in his flash fiction, like, and I guess there's no, I don't know how to explain it, but his lists are masterpieces. So.
Nice shout out to Jack, and who's done a lot of wonderful work actually for today too. Any other thoughts on that? We might hear how we're going to finish up. We'll listen to 2 more pieces, and then we'll maybe just do a round of tips for emerging, aspiring, developing writers, and I think that the conversation so far has been amazing for me. So we've got Lola and Riga to read if you'd like. We would love to hear some of your work, and especially after those comments about sort of musicality and pulse. I think it's you've really got us thinking about the sort of way that I think it's not just that writing has movement, but the way in which it sort of moves us in ways too. Lola, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I was thinking about the topic of this conversation, and last year I wrote this collection of poetry and prose poetry that was in response to Coetzee's novel Disgrace, which is set in South Africa. And I lived for a couple years in Africa, in East Africa and South Africa. So reading about that last year really transported me back to that place, even though it's in a different time. So I thought for this evening, I'm gonna read the opening poem of that little collection, if that's all right. So this is called Our Efforts. Dawn seeps through the cracks and into our eyes. You withhold your heart like floorboards learn to withhold memory. Fire takes our houses, but it cannot reach our souls, I tell myself. When I was 7, I watched a man's home fall in flames. The air held its scent for days, a beacon of light striking against the blackened sky. Now I lie, my hands full with feeling from last night's sleep, and my mind alive with memory, new and old, the things that go to make a person, fragments of ourselves lost each time the wind changes. We are controlled by something larger than ourselves, the season, God, how the sun goes up and sets its head against the heavens, what the season, God, decides to give us, harvest, rainfall, blood, the tendon that runs from me to you, so that when you ache, it starts a panging in my heart, and when you are silent, I feel my voice slip out from under me like it was never there at all. Thank you.
Whew. Lola, that's bloody brilliant. That's sort of, I just feel like we need a moment of pause to take that in. Wow, the air held the scent for days. That was beautiful. Thank you. Riga, do you want to read us a piece of your work?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. And thanks everyone for sharing your pieces and your thoughts. Since Shelley brought up catalog, I thought I'd share a catalog poem that I wrote during the pandemic. I'm sure I won't do justice to the standard set by Jack, but let's see. This one is called Catalog of Daily Salvations. Fat cat claiming my chest at first light, soft fur and sleepy eyes, clear sphere of snot between nose and mouth. How many mornings she has saved my life. Glowing zigzag of my wife's bare leg, freed from the covers when I get out of bed and turn around to look again. Sturdy beam of her thigh, her wonderful finger toes. Among the despairs of the day, coffee, grinder, clean sink sometimes. Walking out to find the calamansi plant on fire with little white flowers, and the old tenant's mystery tree revealing itself to be frangipani. Lemon zest on microplane grater, possibilities of the 8-liter pressure cooker. First sip of 6 p.m. beer, one can split into 2 short glasses. Orange peep of a new heliconia. Spaghetti puttanesca with a fried egg on top. Night of cups as purple-haired skateboarder with Slurpee and boombox. My grandmother's love in the calm yellow gaze of the otherwise skittish cat. Turning on the patio string lights at sundown. Entering the bedroom to find the hot, heavy, heady fragrance of some nameless flower hanging over the bed like a ghost. Demanding I ask myself how such miracles are even possible. Lunch of barely there leftovers raised to heaven with mango pickle, vinegared onions, and cucumber raita. Sunbird's iridescent neck in the window during a Zoom call. Full moon sliding out from beneath an apartment building and hanging over the man-made canal. My soul hanging from the topmost clothespin, pegged in place at all its odd edges, stretched out and see-through like a perfect sheet of pasta. I fly, float, flutter, and sink 1,000 times every hour. So many little angels touch me, nudge me back to the center, the narrow beam of minutes and days, I wish the work would be done. Turbulent plane would finally crash. I raise and land afoot, tipping this way and that, sometimes sailing, sometimes barely hanging by my finger toes. Thank you.
That was really beautiful. I feel like both your piece and Lola's piece have just sort of trilled all my senses alive. There's something very sensory about the way you both write that is, yeah, really seducing in a way that is incredible. Do you want to say anything about that piece? You're welcome to, or to just let it be there for us to have in our ears and body.
Thank you. I guess I'll say that I didn't realize until after I wrote it that it really was a piece about mental health, which had come up so often during the pandemic as well, and what each of us did privately to survive the past 2 years. I also, the form of the catalog can be so freeing. Anyone can write a catalog poem. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Is writing for you a reflection of your worlds or a flight from it? Does anyone want a reflection of the world or a flight from it? Does anyone want to have a go at that question? It's a great question.
I'll jump in for a sec, because this kind of touches on what we kind of, well, what I crashed around before. So yeah, I think it's a, for me, it's, and I think this is possibly the case for other people, it's kind of a weird combination where the two aspects kind of wrestle for dominance, or maybe coexist, or I don't know. It's a bit of both, like, because I certainly find, especially in the kind of writing that really engages with maybe the world or with issues a bit more, you're kind of writing, yeah, there's a tension, and I think it's hard to untangle the two, and that possibly that trying to resolve that tension unsuccessfully is maybe what makes a piece of writing, you know, gives it its meaning and place in the world. Yeah, that's my contribution there.
I think writing can be an escape or a flight from the world, but one of the, again, I guess it depends on how you use it or how you choose to write. And I think one of the things that I'm drawn to most in writing, or in art in general for that matter, is how it allows us to be in the world in a way that is much more visceral even than our real reality. And I think that that's maybe even more, something about that is more poignant even than the escapism, that intense connection, that, and again, maybe it comes back to intimacy, that you can really reach through, you know, I guess fiction, even if it's autobiographical, sometimes it's fictionalized as soon as you even try to put it to paper, and something about that allows for a kind of intimacy that's even more real than reality itself sometimes, which is interesting.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive, I think, the idea of flighting away from the world and dwelling in it intensely, because the world is what it is, but what it can be at the same time, I guess. I think that's a really interesting thing to think through. So to sort of turn from the more philosophical sort of reflections on writing, it would be nice to think about craft and practice, and the ways in which you've sort of developed your craft over time, which is often a very amorphous process, but nonetheless, there are sort of practical tips and reflections we can offer writers out there. So I think it would be wonderful to just do a round where we think about, particularly maybe when we've written shorter pieces, whether it's poetry or flash fiction, but actually in whatever form you've written. It'd be really nice to hear some of the ways in which you've been kind of fine-tuning your craft over time. I would like to, maybe Shelley, do you want to kick that off? How have you been crafting your craft?
Catherine, I think reading lots and lots of flash fiction, and I still don't quite know which is micro, which is flash, which is longer flash. Like I'm still getting to know all of that, but reading a lot more of that really helps. And with different forms on the paper and all sorts of things, and just, listening to Mega about the cataloging. I didn't even know that it's what it was called, but so read a lot. That's what's helping me.
And do you have any authors? Do people you've mentioned, Jade? Do people have some flash fiction writers that maybe they could mention too? I mean, I was just thinking of Frankie McMillan's one of my favourite New Zealand flash writers.
Well, yeah. I read the Flash Frontier and just like the stuff online. And it's really nice bite-sized pieces, and you can just read a whole lot in one sitting. So, and I know, like, Melanie Dixon and Jack, they're two people I actually know, and of course Michelle. I haven't read your guys, but I'm going to.
Yeah, the wonderful thing about Flash Frontier too is it has both sort of emerging and also very established, sort of side by side. So there's sort of surprises, and yeah, it's a really wonderful collection.
Oh, just one last little thing. I was reading Frank Sargent, an anthology of his work, and he did flash. I didn't even know that. Well, he did very small pieces. So that's just another thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Ataria, do you want to tell us about your crafting of craft?
Yeah. So from a fiction perspective, I think a key thing for me, which you already touched on, Catherine, is actually present. I feel like when I'm feeling like really present, when I'm writing, the writing's better. But even like being present in the character for me is quite important. So I'll like kind of put myself in the character's body and like imagine the world around them. But even as they do something, how does the world affect them? Like if someone falls backward, a pebble pushes into the hand, and then kind of like adding in elements to the environment around it that way. Another thing I do is layering. So I'll do a first draft will have basic elements, but when you go back through your next drafts, like adding in things that now you can see more, you can build more to that world. And I think those details adds depth, and I think the reader really appreciates it actually when there's like, it just makes it more real when there are these things for them to see that you've. So yeah, that's a couple of ways that I do it.
Thank you. Riga.
I think that what I found personally most helpful is to sort of rid myself of the burdens of voice. For such a long time, I thought that, oh, well, this is not really a poem. If it only sounded like this or like that, then it would be a poem. It's so prosaic. It's so this or that. The more you can just be fine with what you sound like when you write, the sooner you can move on to just writing more and more. And I suppose the best way to do that is to find writers who sound a little bit like you. So many times I've been blown away by writing that's prosaic or quite simple and unpoetic, and is just astonishing. The poet Sharon Olds, her writing is very imagistic, but it's so domestic, and terrifying things happen in her writing. So yeah, I think what's been most freeing to me over the past 2-3 years is just being like, this is just what I sound like. This is just what I look like. And it's never going to be any different. And just lean into that.
Very wise. Very wise. Lola.
Well, these have all been very good tips so far. So I'm not really sure what to add. But I think that, well, one kind of mini tip that's always helpful. I think it's really helpful to read stuff aloud, because sometimes your writing changes when you actually read it aloud, and when you actually hear how it sounds and how other people might hear it. There's this kind of, you can see it from a more external perspective, perhaps. And then definitely like what Mruga said about growing into actually who you are instead of always, and it helps to look at, of course, to read other people and read other people whose writing is similar to yours, but eventually I think you do start to hone in on things that really matter to you, or phrases that you really keep coming back to, or images or moments. And I guess allowing yourself the space for that to happen is really valuable. And also allowing the space, even in an individual piece, for that to happen, where you actually write it and you work on it, and then you leave it for a while and come back to it and see how you feel again, if it really resonates as strongly as it did before. I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, very good tips. Very good tips. Victor.
I see we're getting close to the end, so I'll keep my tip quick, as quick as I can. Yeah, I just think that one thing that just jumped into my mind, and this is something in all my writing and poetry, it's a kind of thing that I picked up. Certain writers, Morris G's are very good for it. It's about being able to pick up on the kind of being very attentive to the kind of psychic energy around things without wanting to sound too much of a hippie. It's kind of like, he captures the things that are going on underneath the surface of people in a very powerful way. And lots of writers do that, but he's one that does it for me, and often the darker ways. But I just think, and it's interesting, we've got some, youth authors here and speculative writers here. I know Under the Mountains, it's almost become a cliche, but I mean, the Wilberforces, I mean, what a creation, what an invention. And it only occurred to me later as an adult, that's a part of us, the Wilberforces, the world eaters. They want to take everything over and consume and destroy, and that's all they're interested in, and they're part of us. So that metaphor for something like that, and for children's writers, that's a very powerful thing, which and lots of children's writers do it. They capture these very powerful messages, which we later realise are talking about other things, and so that does give me a bit of hope. So I hope so that's one for the youth authors, especially, a very powerful role you have there, and a responsible one, and it's great to see so many good writers for young people doing it. That's
yes,
it.
I really appreciate you lending me a wonderful metaphor to wrap up, which is the idea of world eaters versus world builders. And I think there are so many metaphors for world eaters, and I think we can all maybe see a similarity in what we do in terms of our attempt to kind of world build in whatever modest way through writing. I think we're at the end of our time, and I've really enjoyed chatting to you all and being part of this conversation. It's a real privilege. I want to thank Michelle also for organizing for us to get together. Thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in and who watches in the future. And we hope that the rest of National Flash Fiction Day goes off really well, and we're looking forward to hearing the winners of the National Flash Fiction Day in a few hours. So thank you, everyone. Ka kite.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Ka kite.